For nearly half a minute following decapitation, a human head may retain a semblance of consciousness. The eyes can blink, and the lips may attempt to form words, suggesting a fleeting awareness as life ebbs away. This grim and haunting possibility likely belonged to Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Anne's fall from grace culminated in one of the most notorious executions in English history. A moment far more macabre than simply the swing of a sword. Most historical accounts of her execution offer a sanitized version of events, glossing over the gruesome details. But a closer examination reveals a far more unsettling truth. Anne's execution was not merely a physical end. It was the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated campaign of psychological torment, emblematic of the Tudor era. In Tudor England, death was rarely the punishment in isolation. It often served as the final act of humiliation, carefully staged for both spectacle and warning. Anne was not executed solely for the alleged crime of treason. Her last days were deliberately crafted to dismantle her spirit, piece by piece. What unfolded was not just a death sentence, but a strategic effort by Henry VIII to obliterate the reputation and legacy of a woman whose influence had become inconvenient. On May 19, 1536, Anne had already spent 17 days confined within the Tower of London, a fortress that had once been a harbinger of her ascent to glory. As she had been crowned Queen of England merely 3 years prior, now the halls that once echoed with her dreams of majesty had transformed into a prison of despair. Henry VIII prolonged Anne's suffering by repeatedly delaying her execution, a cruel tactic designed to intensify her psychological anguish. Even the choice to summon a French swordsman instead of the traditional English axe detail, often portrayed as an act of mercy, heightened the dreadful anticipation of her fate. Yet, in the face of such torment, Anne exhibited an astonishing composure in her final hours. Witnesses described her demeanor as almost cheerful. She smiled and exchanged jokes, a facade that might today be recognized as a form of dissociation, or a mind as instinctive defense mechanism amid unbearable trauma, and even joked about her impending execution, referring to herself as but a little neck. Beneath her forced cheerfulness lay immeasurable emotional torment. She was acutely aware that the accusations against her adultery, incest, conspiracy to murder the king were fabrications intended to strip her reputation bare. The grim reality was that Henry sought far more than her death. He intended to erase her entirely, discrediting her accomplishments, obliterating her memory, and most crucially, undermining the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth. Her execution symbolized not merely the tragic end of a queen, but an elaborate public spectacle aimed at convincing England that she had always merited disgrace. In the weeks leading up to her death, scandalous rumors painted Anne as a seductress and traitor. These fabrications were so preposterous that they would have been dismissed in a fair court, yet in the atmosphere of Henry's England they became powerful propaganda. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned uncharacteristically bright in London, a cruel contrast to the darkness awaiting Anne. The night before, she had attempted to pray but had been unable to find sleep. Records document that she requested the sacrament around 2 a.m., kneeling before it for hours. By dawn, she had been awake for nearly 24 hours, exhausted and fearful, yet somehow strikingly animated when summoned from her chambers. Reports describe her laughing with her attendants, a sign not of serenity, but of a mind unraveling under immense stress. Anne's sentencing had been postponed multiple times, a method employed by Tudor authorities as psychological torture. The uncertainty of not knowing when the axe, or, in this case, the sword would fall, often proved more harrowing than death itself. When the moment arrived, Anne was escorted through hallways she had once traversed as queen. No courtiers bent the knee in her presence, and the guards who accompanied her were there solely to prevent any possibility of escape. Those who had once revered her now looked on with cold indifference, eager to distance themselves from her disgrace. At Tower Green, the scaffold awaited. In contrast to the grand elevated platforms often depicted in films, Anne's scaffold stood a mere 3 feet high, stripping her of dignity and forcing her closer to the jeering crowd. What should have been a solemn occasion evaporated into a carnival atmosphere deliberately staged to amplify her humiliation. The execution itself became a theatrical performance meant to instill fear in anyone, especially women who dared to aspire beyond their station. Before kneeling, Anne was given the customary chance to address the crowd. This gesture was not an act of mercy, but a formality, and her final words had to be chosen with careful deliberation. "Good people, I am come hither to die according to the law, and thus yield myself to its judgment," she declared. On the surface, her words seemed to convey submission and acceptance of her fate. Yet underneath that facade lay subtle defiance. In acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, she skillfully undermined the very charges that condemned her. Most strikingly, Henry was absent. While cinematic portrayals often depict kings observing the downfall of their enemies, Henry remained at Whitehall Palace, awaiting confirmation of Anne's death. His thoughts were not of the woman he had once cherished, but rather of Jane Seymour, his soon-to-be third wife. For Henry, Anne's demise was merely a formality, a clear path toward his next marriage. The choice of a French executioner reflected another layer of cruelty. In England, an axe often required several blows to decapitate, but a sword could deliver a swift and precise death. This meant that Anne would die at the hands of a stranger, her final moments entrusted to someone who had never served her court, symbolically stripping away even the intimacy and recognition of her own homeland. Tradition dictated that she be blindfolded, often framed as an act of mercy to spare the condemned from witnessing the executioner's blade. In reality, it also prevented the victim from flinching or moving. Anne did not lie her head upon a block. Rather, following French custom, she knelt upright, requiring immense stillness as the executioner prepared to strike. Witnesses claimed that her lips moved in silent prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold as she desperately listened for the unseen blade. This anticipation, not knowing when death would come, functioned as a horrendous form of torture. When the blow finally struck, it appeared remarkably clean by Tudor standards, with a single, precise stroke severing her head. But the horror did not end there. Witnesses reported that her lips and eyelids twitched, as if her body were stubbornly clinging to life despite the fatal blow. For several seconds, her body betrayed the tenacity of a life still clinging to consciousness. Igniting distress among onlookers, some fainted while others turned away, unable to bear the grotesque reality. Even in death, Anne was denied the dignity she deserved. No coffin had been prepared to house her remains. Overwhelmed by grief, her attendants were forced to find an old chest to contain her head and body, hastily burying her in the chapel of the Tower, with no proper Christian ceremony. The once crowned Queen of England, adorned with the majesty of a royal ceremony at Westminster Abbey, was now to be hidden away in an unmarked grave. Henry's campaign of erasure did not end with Anne's death. He ordered the destruction of her portraits, the removal of her symbols, and even the silencing of her name at court. The spectacle at the scaffold was only the opening act of a broader intent to expunge Anne Boleyn from the annals of history. The cruelty of her execution was not confined to its immediate aftermath. Shadow extended far beyond her own demise, reaching into the lives of those who loved her, those forced to bear witness to her last moments, and even her young daughter Elizabeth. For the women of her household, those attendants who had shared in Anne's joys and sorrows, the horror was unbearable. They were the ones who had to attend to the gruesome aftermath, cleaning her decapitated body, preparing her head for burial, all while maintaining silence, acutely aware that any sign of defiance could jeopardize their own lives. The psychological scars of that morning haunted them for years, leading at least one attendant to abandon court life in search of refuge within a convent. The aftermath of Anne's execution sent shockwaves through Henry's court. If a crowned queen could be so utterly and completely destroyed, then no one was truly safe. Fear permeated the atmosphere, becoming the air that courtiers breathed. Silence became the only strategy for survival among those who had formerly served in. Elizabeth, barely 3 years old at the time, was abruptly stripped of her royal status, declared illegitimate, and cast out of the line of succession. Her small household was dismantled, her attendants dismissed, and her needs neglected. Court documents reveal that she was left without proper clothing or care, an innocent child punished for her mother's fall from grace. The cruelty inflicted upon this toddler highlighted the brutality of Anne's erasure. Not content with destroying the queen, it seemed imperative to also tarnish her child. Modern interpretations of Tudor executions often sanitize the reality of what transpired. They present a polished image of a noble queen kneeling with dignity, surrounded by a solemn crowd, who bear witness to a swift end. The reality was far more grotesque. The scaffold likely soaked with blood from earlier executions, crawling with flies beneath the oppressive heat of May, and a chaotic atmosphere deliberately orchestrated to amplify the drama of the moment. Supporters of the king were planted in the crowd, hurling insults, branding her a witch, an adulteress, and a traitor. Death alone was not deemed a sufficient punishment. The true penalty lay in humiliation. Even Anne's final speech, typically romanticized in accounts as a moment of noble defiance, was necessitated by her precarious situation. She had to phrase her words with utmost caution. Any hint of rebellion could endanger Elizabeth's future or be seized upon to justify even harsher condemnation. Consequently, she praised Henry as a merciful ruler not out of belief, but because she understood that every word she uttered would be scrutinized by him. The sword that ended Anne's life was emblematic of the theatricality surrounding her execution. Henry had spared no expense, summoning a skilled executioner, renowned for his proficiency. This man had practiced on animals to refine his capacity for a swift, singular stroke that would ensure his hefty payment. Anne's execution was not a simple matter, but a grand production, staged for maximum impact, where there would be no room for a messy struggle or a botched swing that might salvage her humanity. The ritual display was chilling. After severing her head, the executioner hoisted it aloft by its hair, blood still sloshing from the wound, a grotesque fulfillment of justice. Onlookers gasped, as some fainted and others shouted their approval.
Oh.
In that moment, Anne was transformed from a revered queen into a dire warning. The poet Thomas Wyatt, who was imprisoned in the Tower, bore witness to the execution of a woman he once admired. In his writings lamented the loss of the little neck that once wore jewels of grace, now severed and displayed as a grim trophy for the amusement of the crowd. His verses captured the violent metamorphosis of Anne, from a radiant queen at the center of power to a lifeless object held aloft for public consumption. Anne's body was quickly wrapped in linen by her weeping attendants and unceremoniously placed into a crude, chest-likely one that had previously held arrows before being interred beneath the chapel's floor. There was no coffin, no procession, and no appropriate farewell rites for this once-crowned monarch. She was cast away among other executed nobles, buried in an unmarked grave, her ultimate resting place obscured for centuries. This ignoble treatment of Anne Boleyn was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy. Henry wanted her obliterated, not only from life but from collective memory. To society, she would become little more than a cautionary tale, her name uttered only with disdain. For many years following her death, her memory was meticulously scrubbed from history. Painters were commissioned to destroy her likeness, her initials were erased from palatial engravings, and those who had once revered her learned to avoid mentioning her altogether, lest they invoke the king's wrath. The violence inflicted upon Anne Boleyn transcended mere physical harm. It was also a historical erasure. She was diminished, rewritten, and systematically obliterated. Yet the cruelty surrounding her demise did not cease with the noise of her execution. In the years following, Henry's propagandists worked assiduously to recast Anne's execution as an act of mercy. The skilled swordsman was portrayed not as an extravagant showpiece, but as a compassionate choice made by a reluctant king who sought to spare his queen the pain. The grisly truth of her final moments was repackaged as a dignified exit, and this official narrative was repeated and reinforced, laying the groundwork for centuries of historical distortion. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of all was Henry's behavior in the aftermath. Just one day after Anne's execution, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within a mere 2 weeks, they were wed in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The swiftness of this transition was staggering. For Henry, Anne's death was not a tragedy, but a convenient solution to a political problem. She had failed to bear him a male heir, and he quickly moved to replace her with a woman he hoped would succeed where Anne had not. The speed with which life resumed at court is deeply unsettling, highlighting that there was no moment of pause, no mourning, no acknowledgement of the loss of a queen. For Henry, her death signified merely another step in his relentless pursuit of dynastic security. Anne Boleyn's execution was not solely about concluding a life. It was about control, power, and psychological manipulation. In the weeks leading up to her demise, she endured methods we would now recognize as psychological torture. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, and the architect behind the charges against her, ensured that Anne was broken long before she ever stepped onto the scaffold. Relentlessly interrogated, isolated from allies, deprived of sleep, and inundated with misinformation designed to warp her sense of reality, she was systematically rendered fragile and disoriented. By the time she made her way to Tower Green, any resistance she might have mustered had been meticulously dismantled. The execution itself unfolded under an array of unprecedented security measures. The tower's garrison was doubled, and additional guards stationed throughout the grounds. This was not to prevent her escape, to guarantee that none of her sympathizers could intervene, marking the final chapter in the calculated humiliation of a woman who dared to aspire to greatness. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to support our work and never miss an upload. Like this video, drop a comment, and share it with others to show your support and help us grow this historical community.